Have you ever truly stopped to wonder what happens when the kindest soul you know finally lets go? Not out of spite, not because they stopped caring, but because something deep within them, quiet, hidden, and long suppressed, has finally stirred. It's a shift so subtle at first, you might not even notice it. But make no mistake, it is a turning point. They are not breaking down. They are breaking free. Carl Jung once referred to this moment as the return of the repressed psychological awakening, when everything you've buried to survive finally rises up, not to destroy, but to protect. And for the empath, this isn't an explosion. It's a disappearance. They don't yell. They don't blame. They don't beg to be seen. They vanish. Not because they're weak, no. Quite the opposite. They've accessed a kind of strength that most people never even knew they had. You've probably heard it all your life. You're too sensitive. But here's the question. What if the world got it wrong? What if your sensitivity was never the issue? What if the real problem is a world that equates emotional depth with fragility, that sees empathy as an endless resource to be mined, that mistakes emotional intelligence for emotional labor owed? Empaths are misunderstood not because they're mysterious or emotionally erratic, but because their power operates quietly under the surface until something snaps sand suddenly. The truth can no longer be silenced. From the outside you seem calm, gentle, always there, a safe space, the shoulder to cry on, the midnight call when someone's world is crumbling. But who's there when your world unravels? When you need that shoulder? When your heart carries more weight than it was ever meant to bear? You absorb problems that were never yours to carry, like sponges soaking up grief, anger, and fear that others refuse to acknowledge. You take emotional accountability for choices you didn't make. You grant forgiveness for betrayals that would make most people walk away forever. You make excuses for the inexcusable again and again until even you forget where your boundaries once stood. You've become a sanctuary for everyone else's pain, a shelter no one thinks to check on. Your own sorrow remains unspoken, unnoticed, unmet. You exist in the background, silently holding everyone else together while slowly unraveling at the seams. Jung described this as a psychic fracture, the unbearable tension between who we are, who we pretend to be, to gain love, approval, safety. For empaths, that mask is the eternal giver, the one who never needs help, never says no, never runs out of kindness. You've mastered the art of seeming whole while quietly falling apart, of smiling through emotional hunger, of staying in conversations that drain the last drop of your energy while pretending you're not dying inside. You've listened to the same wounds, the same complaints, same chaos, over and over, like a silent anchor in everyone's storm. But behind that serene mask lives someone who's rarely, if ever, been fully seen, fully held. Still think, the empath is soft? Or have you started to see the quiet power that lives in someone who loves this deeply and finally decides to walk away? They disappear. Not out of weakness, but from a strength no one ever expected them to possess. ... Someone who carries the emotions others discard, like they're personally responsible for the healing of everyone around them. Someone who has convinced themselves over years of conditioning that being needed is the same as being loved, that if you're useful, you must be valued, that your worth lies in how much you can give, fix, or absorb without complaint. But deep down in the quiet places you rarely visit, you know that's not true. It never was. Underneath all the people-pleasing, the emotional caregiving, self-sacrifice you've been told is love, there's a truth you've tried to ignore. But it waits patiently, like a whisper beneath the noise. So pause for a moment. Ask yourself, when was the last time someone asked how you were doing and actually stayed to hear the real answer? When was the last time someone held space for your pain, the way you constantly hold space for theirs? The truth is, you've carried the emotional weight of your relationships for so long, it feels normal. But that weight has left you weary. You've been so busy being everyone else's anchor, you've forgotten what it feels like to rest. You've built a life around being safe for others, while silently drowning yourself. You've poured from an empty cup for so long that fullness feels like a memory. You've shown more love to others than you've ever shown to yourself, so much so that the idea of self-love feels alien, selfish, even wrong. And eventually, something inside begins to cave in. Not loudly, not dramatically, but slowly, quietly, invisibly. Yet what follows next is not a collapse. It's not weakness. It's not even a breakdown, though at times it may feel like one. It's the start of something much deeper, profound shift. A transformation so fundamental that it doesn't just change how you feel, changes who you are. It's your soul saying no more fragmentation. Your psyche refusing to shatter into smaller and smaller pieces just to keep others whole. This awakening doesn't arrive with lightning or noise. It starts in whispers, subtle shifts, barely visible changes that others might dismiss as a bad mood or a passing phase. But inside, you know something is different. You begin to pull back. You stop replying to messages right away. Where once a delayed response would send you spiraling into guilt, now you allow space. Minutes, hours, even days. You let the phone ring without rushing to pick it up. This time you don't drown in shame for it. You withdraw from conversations that used to devour your emotional bandwidth. You stop volunteering for emotional labor that no one else is willing to carry. You no longer rush to fill uncomfortable silences or rescue awkward moments. You stop laughing on cue. Stop smiling just to soften the room. Still show up, but not in the same way. Your body is there, but your soul begins to step back. Not out of cruelty, but for survival. You create distance, not because you've stopped caring, but because you're finally learning to care for yourself. This is what Jung called the tension of opposites, the unbearable psychological pressure of trying to hold light and shadow, love and anger, care and exhaustion, all at once, of pretending to be whole when your inner world is splitting under the weight of contradiction. And maybe, just maybe, you've felt this tension too. Someone who carries the emotions others discard, like they're personally responsible for the healing of everyone around them. The way your body says yes, while your soul screams no. The way you smile, hold space, offer comfort while something inside you quietly fades. One unspoken truth at a time. Let me tell you about Sarah. She was 32, a social worker by training, but an emotional caretaker by instinct. The friend who never let a call go unanswered at 3 a.m., even when her own heart was breaking. The daughter who played peacemaker in every family conflict, absorbing emotional debris so others could walk away intact. The colleague who stayed late to rescue others from missed deadlines, while her own projects silently gathered dust in forgotten folders. For over 3 decades, Sarah held it all. She carried the weight of other people's chaos with a hope so pure it almost hurt, that if she just loved hard enough, gave enough, understood enough, they'd change. She believed that silence about her own needs made her strong, noble even. That being emotionally available at all times was not only her role but her identity, her purpose. But silence has a cost, and over time, that cost adds up. Her nervous system began sounding alarms her mind refused to hear. Headaches that no medication could numb, sleepless nights staring at the ceiling. Her body aching for rest while her thoughts ran marathons through everyone else's pain. A heaviness in her chest that felt like drowning in slow motion. She found herself gasping for emotional air in relationships where she was always the rescuer, administering mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to others while no one noticed she was the one suffocating. Her body screamed what her voice had been trained to whisper, "I'm not okay." And then, one day the breaking point arrived, not with an explosion, not with betrayal or drama, but with quiet, chilling clarity. It was an ordinary Tuesday. Her sister called, crying about the same toxic relationship they'd dissected 100 times before. The same excuses, the same circular pain, and once again the same unspoken expectation. Sarah, absorb this, fix this, give meaning to my chaos. But this time, Sarah felt nothing. Not anger. It had burned out long ago. Not frustration. That required hope. Not even the worn thread of compassion, because that well had finally run dry. What she felt instead was something sharper, cleaner, more absolute, quiet, crystalline clarity. A truth that rose up from the deepest part of her being and echoed through her entire body. I'm done. Maybe you know this moment. That shift when caring stops feeling like love and starts feeling like self-abandonment. When empathy no longer feels like a gift, but like a cage you've built for yourself. It's in that moment, it's that quiet rupture, that Carl Jung's concept of the shadow begins to rise, not as darkness, but as the parts of yourself you've long exiled just to be accepted, not evil, not wrong, just unheard. The parts that can say no without guilt. The parts that choose self-protection over endless self-sacrifice. The parts that no longer agree to burn so others can stay warm. The way your body says yes while your soul screams. No, Sarah's wall didn't build itself overnight. It wasn't sudden, and it didn't come from bitterness or anger. It rose gradually, silently, almost imperceptibly, brick by brick. Moment by moment, each brick was formed from years of quiet betrayals. Every time she was overlooked in a conversation, she was actively holding together. Every time her kindness was interpreted as weakness. Each time her constant presence was treated as a given instead of a gift. Every moment someone leaned on her listening ear without ever thinking to offer theirs in return. This wall doesn't scream, it doesn't accuse, doesn't point fingers, doesn't demand explanations or apologies, doesn't come bearing ultimatums or revenge. It simply exists, solid, steady, and unmoving. A quiet but powerful boundary, built between who she once was and who she is now becoming. And behind that wall, she stands not afraid anymore, not ashamed, not guilty, but finally, unavailable. Unavailable to be used, to be drained. To be the emotional scaffolding for everyone else's instability. This isn't cruelty. It's not detachment, not emotional numbness, not dissociation, despite what others might call it when they feel. The absence of your old self. No, this is your nervous system speaking the truth. Your voice never felt safe enough to express, "I've had enough." Carl Jung understood this deeply. He believed the human psyche has a natural drive not toward perfection, but toward wholeness, a return to integration. And when we split ourselves, when we suppress our needs, silence our truths, perform roles that deny our reality just to keep the peace, something within us begins to rebel. A slow but persistent push toward healing. A reclaiming of what we buried to feel wanted, needed, accepted. So ask yourself honestly, what part of you have you kept quiet just to feel loved? Which truths have you swallowed so many times they've nearly disappeared? It's collapse. You're experiencing this exhaustion, this sudden emotional withdrawals and weakness breaking through. It's your strength finally stepping forward. It's your soul saying, "I won't fragment anymore. I won't abandon myself for the sake of other people's comfort. I won't disappear to make others feel whole." This is the beginning of something powerful. This is where you start becoming dangerous. And this is the moment right here where people begin to misunderstand you. Friends, family, partners. They look at you now with confusion, maybe even alarm. You're quieter, less available, not rushing to soothe, to explain, to fix. You're no longer offering yourself like an emotional sponge, absorbing all their pain and chaos without question. They call you different, distant, changed. They say, you're not yourself anymore. The irony. This is the most yourself you've ever been. They want the old version of you back, the one who turned other people's dysfunction into compassion. It's the one who made emotional immaturity feel like your personal responsibility. The one who absorbed their chaos and called it love. But what's happening now? What Jungian psychology calls shadow integration is not coldness. It's not selfishness. It's something much deeper, something far more profound. And yes, infinitely more dangerous to those who depended on your self-abandonment. It's the quiet, radical undoing of the mask you wore for far too long. For most of your life, you've carried what Jung called the persona, the mask of the perpetual giver, the eternal helper, the one who exists primarily to serve others' emotional needs. This Persona was likely formed in childhood, in the quiet, tender moments when you learned that love came with conditions. Based on how well you could regulate the emotions of others, you were rewarded not for being your true self, but for being what others needed you to be. Their comfort became your mission, chaos, your responsibility. You adapted, performed, accommodated, and slowly your authenticity was exchanged for approval, but every persona carries within it a hidden counterpart, a shadow. And for empaths, that shadow isn't filled with malice or darkness. It's filled with the very things you were conditioned to suppress. Self-protection, boundaries that keep you safe, a healthy, life-preserving form of selfishness. You were taught these were shameful. You were told that choosing yourself was somehow unkind, unloving, even cruel. But it's not. Sarah's integration began the day she stopped explaining herself. It wasn't some grand declaration or dramatic confrontation. It started with a simple moment. Her sister called again, falling into the same cycle they'd repeated for years. Crisis. Call Sarah. Offload emotional baggage. Feel better. Hang up. Repeat in 2 weeks, but this time something was different. Instead of jumping into the familiar automatic response, "Tell me everything. I'm here for you," Sarah paused. And then she said the words that would quietly shift the ground beneath there. Relationship. I'm not available for this conversation. Right now. That was it. No justification. It's no long-winded apology or explanation about her energy, schedule, or mood. No false promise to reschedule. No emotional cushioning to make her boundary more palatable. It's just a clear, direct truth about where she stood. Her sister was stunned into silence. Then came the backlash. Predictable, piercing. You're being selfish. I need someone to talk to. What's wrong with you? But this time, Sarah didn't backpedal. She didn't soothe, explain, or absorb the anger. For the first time in her 32 years, she met the accusation head-on and replied with the most radical honesty of her life. Yes, I'm being selfish, and there's nothing wrong with me. That yes is perhaps the most dangerous word an empath can learn to speak. Because once you stop being ruled by the desperate fear of losing someone, something deeper begins to guide you. The absolute refusal to lose yourself ever again. From that moment on, everything changes. You stop explaining your boundaries too. Those who never respected them, you'd stop offering your worth on a platter to people who fed on it without gratitude. You'd stop playing the role of the endlessly understanding one, the always available one, the emotional anchor for everyone else's storm, while you silently drowned. This is what Carl Jung called individuation. It's not rebellion. It's the process of becoming whole by embracing, integrating the parts of yourself you abandoned just to feel loved. The part that can say no without collapsing in guilt. The part that can choose silence over pleading for understanding. Part that can walk away from love that demands your erasure. Think about it. How many of your relationships would remain intact if you stopped being the one who always gave more, cared more, tried harder? If you stopped contorting yourself just to keep the peace? Once this integration begins, once you start reclaiming the pieces of yourself, head to exile in order to be accepted, you become dangerous. Not because you inflict pain on others, but because the old ways of being used, manipulated, and emotionally drained can no longer reach you. You're no longer baited into circular arguments that resolve nothing. You're no longer hooked by guilt, dragged by obligation, or paralyzed by the fear of disappointing others. You're no longer seduced by potential that exists only in your imagination. You're no longer captivated by promises that echo with hope, but are hollow in action. The dream of who someone could be no longer holds more weight than who they actually are today. You no longer cling to possibilities that require you to abandon reality or yourself. And when apologies come without changed behavior, without consistency or accountability, you're no longer moved. They no longer pierce your heart the way they once did. You've walked through the fire of your own emotional abandonment and discovered something incredible. You didn't disappear. You didn't burn to ash. You emerged, reforged by pain, made sharper by honesty, and shaped into something more grounded, more unmistakably yourself than you ever imagined you could be. People around you notice. They notice immediately. And their responses, they reveal everything. The truth about those past relationships rises to the surface like oil and water. Some panic. They escalate. Suddenly their needs become louder, more urgent, more demanding. They claw at your time, your emotional energy, your familiar availability. They reach for guilt. They weaponize memories, reminding you of every time they needed you, of how much you gave. But it's not about love. It's about control. They can't comprehend a version of you that finally puts yourself first. Others simply disappear without your willingness to be their emotional landfill. They drift silent, detached. It becomes clear they were never really there for you. The connection wasn't mutual. It wasn't built on shared care. It was extractive. You were a resource, not a relationship. But then there are the rare ones, the precious few, the ones who have loved you as you truly are, not just as what you provide. They don't flinch at your boundaries. They don't resent your growth. They celebrate it. They've been waiting for this version of youth, the one who values herself as fiercely as they always wished she would. They notice the subtle changes that speak volumes, the way you no longer scramble to fill awkward silences, the way you let others own their emotional storms without rushing in to shield them with your own skin, the way you finally choose your peace, your inner stillness, over the temporary comfort of keeping others unbirthed. To those who used you, it feels like loss. But to you, it feels like coming home. Like finding a version of yourself you'd nearly forgotten. Like ending a lifetime of self-exile and finally unlocking the door to your own soul. This is what Jung meant by the transcendent function. It's not a theory, it's a lived experience. A tension between opposites, between love and boundaries. Between care and self-respect, held long enough for something new to be born. A new way of being. You are still kind, still soft, still deeply empathetic and loving. But now those traits are no longer born from depletion. They come from fullness. From conscious choice, rather than unconscious obligation. From strength, not the terror of abandonment. You still love others, but no longer more than you love yourself. You care, but you no longer sacrifice your sanity just to soothe theirs. You still help, but you no longer drown just to save someone who won't learn to swim. Ask yourself, when did you first realize that being needed is not the same as being valued? That being useful isn't the same as being loved? This is the birth of the dangerous empath. Dangerous not because she harms, but because she refuses to be harmed in the ways she once allowed. Dangerous to systems that depended on her silence. Dangerous to relationships that relied on her self-erasure. Dangerous to a cultural narrative that mistook feminine strength for endless sacrifice. You become dangerous to anyone who mistook your kindness for weakness, your empathy for obedience, your love for something they could endlessly consume without ever offering anything in return. People don't fear the empath when they're giving everything. They praise them, rely on them, even idolize them for their endless generosity. But the fear creeps in, almost silently, the moment the empath stops giving anything that isn't freely chosen. That's when the shift happens and the discomfort begins. Because the person who once absorbed everyone's anxiety like a sponge now reflects it back with the clarity of a mirror sharp. It's undeniable and unfiltered. The one who once translated chaos into compassion now lets that chaos stand on its own, raw, messy, unsoftened. The one who used to rush to interpret others' dysfunction in the most generous light now simply witnesses it without commentary, without defense, without rescue. And that stillness, that refusal to engage in the old dance, unsettles people, especially those who built their emotional equilibrium on the empath's willingness to collapse inward. They thrived while the empath lived in discomfort, called it love, and wore exhaustion like a badge of honor. It terrifies them, because your peace now exists outside their control, because your discomfort no longer bends to accommodate theirs. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." For the empath, that arrival, the moment of becoming, isn't loud. It doesn't explode into the room or beg for recognition. It's subtle, silent, even but utterly irreversible. Sarah's family noticed it at the next holiday gathering. For over 20 years, she'd been the unspoken glue, the emotional mediator, the silent fixer. Whenever tension rose, she would intervene, soften the edges, translate the subtext into something tolerable. She'd absorbed dysfunction and disguised it as harmony. But this time was different. When her uncle made his routine passive-aggressive jab at her mother's cooking, and her mother deflected with wounded martyrdom, Sarah didn't intervene. She didn't jump in to protect, to redirect, to ease the discomfort hanging heavy in the air. She simply kept eating her dinner. Calm. Unmoved, she let the comment land. She let the silence stretch thick, awkward, filled with generations of unspoken resentment and emotional avoidance.
Oh.
Everyone turned to her instinctively, waiting for her to break the silence, to fix it all again, to smooth over the cracks they refused to address. But Sarah didn't move. Because Sarah had quietly retired her magic wand, she was no longer available to translate emotional immaturity into digestible conversation. No longer willing to be the filter through which everyone else found stability. Later, her aunt whispered to her mother, loud enough for Sarah to hear, of course. Sarah seems different, cold, distant, not like herself. The truth was, Sarah wasn't cold. For the first time in her life, she was warm toward herself. She wasn't abandoning others. She was simply no longer abandoning herself. This is what makes the integrated empath so threatening to systems built on emotional labor extraction. You begin to guard your inner calm more fiercely than you once guarded your reputation. Longer step in to convert chaos into clarity. You no longer assume responsibility for discomfort that doesn't belong to you. You begin to feel the tension in a room. No, it doesn't need to be yours to solve. Stop rushing in with emotional bandages and start choosing intentional silence. You realize you don't owe anyone your performance. You begin choosing solitude over emotional theatrics, authenticity over artificial harmony, your own approval over borrowed validation. You start becoming someone who no longer exists to serve the needs of others at the cost of herself. And that, to those who depended on your emotional compliance, is terrifying. You develop what I call selective empathy. The deep feeling remains your sensitivity, your compassion, your emotional intuition, but it's no longer running the show. You're still able to feel the suffering in another person's voice, see the ache behind their smile. But you're no longer compulsively stepping in to fix, to soothe, to save. You can recognize pain without internalizing it. You can offer presence without sacrifice. You can now witness someone's struggle without drowning in it yourself. You've learned to stay grounded, to hold space without being consumed by what that space contains. To those on the outside, especially, those who once relied on your tendency to abandon yourself in service of their needs, this new behavior looks unrecognizable. Some might call it cold. Others might label it unkind. But to someone who's endured years, perhaps, even decades of emotional starvation while feeding everyone else, this isn't cruelty. This is self-respect. This is what psychological sovereignty looks like. You're no longer waiting for someone else to choose you, validate you, notice you, because you've already made the most important choice. You've chosen yourself. Let me tell you about Marcus. He was that friend, the dependable one, always available, always giving. He picked up the check at dinner without hesitation. He offered his couch, his car, his time, his heart. Whenever someone was in a crisis, Marcus was the first call. Not because he had the most to give, but because he never said no. His apartment slowly became a revolving door. Breakups, breakdowns, late night. Emergencies. Marcus opened his door, his wallet, his soul. To be needed was to be worthy. To say yes was to be loved. To always be available was to be good. But years of pouring from an empty cup eventually take their toll. Marcus didn't lose his ability to love, but something inside him broke. His willingness to love people more than they loved themselves began to fracture. The turning point came quietly, during another all-too-familiar request. A friend asked to borrow money for the 5th time in 6 months. Each time before, Marcus had said yes, though repayment never came. Each time it was labeled an emergency. But this time, Marcus paused, and then he said simply, "No." No long-winded story about his budget. No softening the blow with a counteroffer. No guilt-drenched apology. Just one word. Clear. Final. Liberating. His friend stared in disbelief. "But I thought you cared about me," they said. Their voice dripping with wounded accusation, twisting Marcus's empathy into a weapon against him. "I do care about you," Marcus replied, calm and certain.
Ow.
"But I care about me too now." That single sentence changed everything. But I care about me too now. That is the turning point, the moment when self-respect finally takes root. It's not rejection. It's reclamation. This level of emotional maturity is threatening to a world built on codependency, people-pleasing, and the quiet exploitation of empathetic souls. When you stop participating in relationships that require you to shrink too. Be smaller, quieter, more compliant, people notice. They react. Some escalate. They demand more of your energy, more access to your time, more justification for your new boundaries. When you stop engaging with those who view your self-protection as betrayal, they call you difficult. When you no longer beg to be seen, they call you arrogant. When you stop sacrificing yourself to be accepted, they call you changed. But here's the truth they don't want to see. You haven't become cruel. You've become unavailable for cruelty, for manipulation. For relationships built on imbalance, you no longer offer yourself up as a buffer between people and their consequences. You no longer validate the cultural gaslighting that tells you healthy boundaries are selfish, that emotional protection is cold, that saying no is unkind. You have simply stopped apologizing for protecting your own peace. You no longer buy into the narrative that your worth is measured by your willingness to suffer for others' comfort. That old belief that enduring pain was a badge of love, that discomfort was the cost of being needed, no longer holds power over you. You've stepped outside that story, and from the outside, the truth is startlingly clear. Have you noticed how differently people treat you when you stop being the go-to fixer? The emotional shock absorber, the one who always steps in no matter the cost. Have you seen how certain relationships begin to dissolve, almost silently, when you are no longer the one who gives more, cares harder, or tries endlessly to maintain the connection? This isn't about becoming heartless. It's about having a heart that finally belongs to you first and foremost. You still love deeply, fiercely, but now that love flows from a place of conscious choice, not from the desperate compulsion to prove your worth through sacrifice. You still care, but your caring no longer demands the surrender of your own well-being. You no longer place your needs on the altar of someone else's temporary peace. And because of this, something remarkable happens. You've become fluent in the language of discernment, table to sense. Almost instantly, the difference between someone who genuinely values your presence and someone who merely craves access to your energy. You feel the distinction between those who love you and those who love what you do for them. And now, you honor that inner knowing more than any external expectation, even when it means disappointing those who grew comfortable with your self-abandonment, even when they call it selfishness, even when they guilt you for changing. This is what makes you dangerous in the most beautiful, unapologetic way possible. In the end, the fed-up empath isn't vengeful. They're not bitter or cold or incapable of love. They are free. Free from the exhausting performance of constantly being what others needed them to be. Free from the background anxiety of managing everyone else's emotional weather while ignoring their own storms. Free from the crushing burden of believing their worth depended on how useful, how agreeable, how endlessly giving they could be. Take Sarah. For example, now, 3 years into her transformation, she lives a life that her past self would barely recognize. She's surrounded by friends who reciprocate her energy instead of draining it. She sets boundaries and they're respected, not resented or ignored. She's learned to feel deeply without being consumed, to love fully without disappearing into someone else's chaos. She still works as a social worker, but even that has changed. Now she approaches her clients with professional compassion, not personal rescue fantasies. She holds space for their pain but no longer absorbs it into her body like she once did. She supports their growth but doesn't carry the burden of their choices. Her romantic life has shifted dramatically too. No longer drawn to broken wings or unhealed wounds, she now seeks partners who are emotionally equal people, who can meet her in the middle, not drag her into roles she never agreed to play. She's not a therapist in her relationships, not a fixer, not a savior. The man she's currently dating noticed it early on. "You're so independent," he remarked during one of their first serious conversations. And though it sounded like a compliment, there was a trace of confusion in his tone, a faint complaint perhaps, as if he'd expected love to mean unrestricted access to her emotional labor, as if he was slowly realizing that in this relationship, emotional responsibility would be mutual. "Yes," she replied simply. There was no need for further elaboration. Her tone didn't waver. Her posture didn't shrink. She didn't follow the declaration with reassurance or softening. That one sentence held generations of women learning to choose themselves. And in that moment, he was faced with a quiet crossroads. Would he love her as she was, in her wholeness, or attempt to mold her into something more manageable? Would he honor her sovereignty or try to possess it? He had to decide whether he was truly interested in partnership, where both people stand. As equals are in possession, where one quietly diminishes so the other can expand. Fortunately, he chose love. Not the performative kind, but the real kind, the kind that makes space instead of taking it. This grounded, self-possessed version of love's what Carl Jung referred to as the individuated self. A soul no longer split in two. It's no longer torn between pleasing others and honoring itself. A human being who has integrated their shadows and reclaimed their light. You've turned your pain into discernment, your silence into a sanctuary. Every wound that once left you raw and exposed has now become a boundary, not to punish others, but to protect your peace. The dangerous empath isn't dangerous because they become cruel or indifferent. No, they're dangerous because they can no longer be used. They're dangerous because they're no longer available for manipulation, for emotional extraction, for endless self-sacrifice. They no longer confuse love with self-erasure. They've reclaimed their softness and paired it with an unshakable, radiant sense of self-worth. They've come to understand something powerful. Real love doesn't ask you to shrink. Healthy relationships don't demand that you bleed just to keep the peace. Your sensitivity, it's dismissed as too much, is no longer a flaw to be fixed. It is your superpower. It's deserving of protection, reverence, and space. You've learned to distinguish the sacred nuances, the difference between being loving and being available on demand, between being kind and being exploitable, between being empathetic and being used as a dumping ground for others' unresolved pain. In a world that preys on softness, confuses compassion for compliance, the one who reclaims their gentleness with wisdom becomes almost untouchable. Not because they've hardened, because they've become whole. You become the kind of light that doesn't ask for permission to shine. You don't wait for external validation to illuminate. You glow from within because that is your nature. When you stop dimming yourself to make others feel more comfortable in their shadows. The integrated Empatha, one who has come home to themselves, loves more purely. Why? Because they love. By choice, not compulsion. They give not out of emptiness or obligation, but from overflow, from fullness. They connect more deeply. Because they're no longer trying to disappear inside someone else to escape their own skin. This is your individuation. This is your return to self. This is your dangerous. It's a radiant awakening to your own immeasurable worth. You're not the empath who collapses under the weight of everyone else's expectations. You're the empath who broke free and in doing so discovered the unshakable strength that was always there. Waiting beneath the layers of people-pleasing and over-functioning, you're no longer the one who loves until there's nothing left of yourself. You've become the one who understands finally and fully that the most loving thing you can ever do is to stay whole while loving others. You're not the one who gives themselves away piece by piece until they disappear. You're no longer the person who chips away at their own essence, quietly vanishing under the weight of everyone else's needs. You've stepped away from the slow erosion of your identity that used to masquerade as love. Instead, you've come to realize something powerful. Your presence is the gift and not your disappearance. It's not your silence, not your self-neglect. You've stopped equating self-sacrifice with kindness. You now know that showing up for others should never mean walking out on yourself. What would shift in your world? Truly, if you believed in your bones, not just as a fleeting thought, but as an embodied truth that you are just as worthy of. The love, tenderness, care, and devotion you so freely give to others. What would you choose differently? How would you speak, love, or rest if your self-worth were never in question? The world is in desperate need of empaths, but not empaths who burn out trying to fix everything. Not empaths who bleed to keep others warm. It needs empaths who know their worth. Empaths who can sit with deep emotion without getting swept away in the undertow. Empaths who can love with their whole hearts, yet never abandon those hearts in the process. Empaths who can give generously as but from a place of overflow, not depletion. Your journey through the shadow, through integration, through the dangerous and beautiful awakening to your own value, this is not merely about personal growth. It's not some isolated act of self-improvement. This is a radical act of love. A powerful stand for a world that has forgotten what healthy love, balanced connection, and mutual respect truly look like. You become the living proof, the visible embodiment that softness doesn't mean surrender, that love can coexist with limits. That compassion does not equal self-erasure. You are the walking reminder that it's possible, essential, even to be both soft and strong, both generous and self-protective, both loving and bound Aried. In becoming dangerous to those who only knew how to use you, you become profoundly safe for those who want to love you for real. You become a lighthouse, a beacon to other empaths who are still drowning in their own compassion, who still mistake self-sacrifice for love, who still believe their value lies in how much pain they can endure for others. Your transformation offers them silent permission to choose themselves, to set boundaries without guilt, to remain whole while loving fiercely. Your boundaries don't push people away. They light the path towards self-respect. Your refusal to abandon yourself becomes a quiet revolution, reminding others that they don't have to abandon themselves either. In a world starving for authentic connection, craving relationships rooted in mutuality rather than manipulation, searching for love that heals instead of drains, your particular brand of dangerous tenderness is exactly the medicine we need. You're not too much. You never were. You're not too sensitive, not too emotional, not too intense. You're not wrong for caring deeply. You are perfectly calibrated for this moment in time. The world has misjudged your sensitivity as weakness, but in truth, it's your greatest strength when wielded with clarity. When offered by conscious choice instead of compulsion, the dangerous empath is not the one who shuts off feeling. They're the one who feels everything but chooses their responses deliberately. They love fully, not out of lack, but from fullness. They've learned that the highest act of service isn't sacrificing who you are, it's becoming who you were always meant to be. Your journey to wholeness matters not just for you, but for every soul who will be changed, healed, and inspired by your presence. Your authentic, boundaried, and consciously loving presence in this world is not just valuable, it's vital.